summer of 1875, in the dusty square of Red Creek, out in the American West. Mayor Galt's wooden gavel exploded into splinters under a single, chillingly precise gunshot. The crowd froze. Out of the swirling dust at the edge of town, a man in a dark coat walked forward slow, unhurried, cold, and threw a heavy sack of gold at the mayor's feet. "She's not for sale," he said, his voice rough, worn down like something weathered by time. "But I'll pay anyway. So there's no confusion about who she's leaving with." On the auction block, Clara Hayes clenched her rope-scared hands, heart-pounding, unable to look away from the stranger who just pulled her back from being sold like property. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know if following him would lead her to salvation or straight into something far worse. A secret buried beneath Red Creek. A blood debt still unpaid. And an escape that's only just begun. It all unfolds next in the auction at Red Creek. Hit follow now so you don't miss it. The sun hit Red Creek like a punishment. It was the kind of August heat that made men mean and made the dust rise up and cling to everything, to the wooden storefronts, to the horses tied at the rail, to the back of Clara Hayes's neck, where the rope chafed her skin raw. She stood on the auction block. She kept her eyes forward. She would not look at the ground. She would not give them that. Mayor Galt wiped the sweat from his jowls with a handkerchief that had never been clean a day in its life. He walked the length of the platform slowly, like he was proud of something. His boots were expensive. His soul was cheap. He'd had Clara's hands bound that morning when she'd tried to run, and he hadn't apologized for the rope burns. He just smiled, "Gentlemen," Galt called out, spreading his arms wide. "What we have here is a fine, healthy woman. Educated, too. Father was that cartographer fella who went and got himself killed last spring. Shame about that." He let out a short, wet laugh. "But his land now belongs to the county, and his daughter here, well, she belongs to whoever bids highest." Nobody in that crowd moved. There were maybe 40 people standing in the square. Ranchers, shopkeepers, a preacher in a black coat who kept staring at his own shoes. Clara looked at them one by one, searching for something human, a flinch, a frown, anything that said this wasn't right. She found nothing. That was the thing about Red Creek. It wasn't that the people were all bad. Most of them weren't, but they had learned slowly, over years of watching Galt do whatever he pleased, that staying quiet was the same as staying safe. So they stood there and said nothing. And their silence was its own kind of crime. The brothel owner named Cord raised his hand first. He had a flat face and small eyes, and he was already looking at Clara, the way you look at a horse you're planning to work until it breaks. $50, Cord said. Clara breathed through her nose. She thought about her father. She thought about the way he used to say that a person's worth wasn't something the world could measure. It was something you carried inside you, and you kept it no matter what anybody did to the outside. She pressed his brass compass against her palm through the thin fabric of her dress pocket. It was the only thing they hadn't taken. "60, said another man in the back. Galt was grinning now. He raised his wooden gavel. Then the shot came. It wasn't a warning shot aimed at the sky. It was precise. It was deliberate. The gavel exploded into splinters right in Galt's hand, and the mayor stumbled back with a shriek that was somewhere between a scream and a squeal, shaking his stinging fingers in the air like he'd touched a hot stove. The crowd scattered sideways. Horses pulled at their ties. Somewhere a woman screamed, and out of the dust, out of the swirling, rising wall of red dirt that the afternoon wind had been building at the edge of town, all day a man walked forward. He was tall, dark coat, dark hat, dark eyes that caught the sun the wrong way and gave nothing back. The spurs on his boots rang out one clean note with every step. He didn't walk fast and he didn't walk slow. He walked like a man who had already decided how this was going to end. Nobody shot at him. Nobody moved at all. There was something about the way he came through that dust, unhurried, unworried, that made the whole crowd understand, all at once and without a word, that this man had walked into worse places than Red Creek and walked back out of all of them. He stopped at the base of the auction block steps. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather sack. He didn't hand it over gently. He threw it. It hit the platform boards at Galt's feet with a sound like a hammer dropping, and a single gold coin rolled out and spun in a lazy circle before falling flat. Galt stared at it. He stared at the man. His face had gone from red to white. "She's not for sale," the man said. His voice was low, rough at the edges, like something worn down by weather. "But I'll pay anyway, so there's no confusion about who she's leaving with." Cord took a step forward. "Now hold on," just as the man looked at Cord. Just looked at him. Cord stopped walking. Clara watched all of this from the platform. Her hands were still bound. Her pulse was loud in her ears. She didn't know this man. She didn't know what he wanted, or why he'd come, or what walking away with him would mean for her. She only knew that the rope around her wrists was real, and the auction block beneath her feet was real, and every second she stood on it was a second she was agreeing by her stillness, by her silence, that this was acceptable. It was not acceptable. The man climbed the 2 steps up to the platform and pulled a short blade from his belt. He cut her bindings in one clean motion. He didn't touch her otherwise. He looked at her straight, brown eyes, tired in a deep way, the kind that sleep doesn't fix. "Can you ride?" he asked. Clara rubbed her wrists. She looked at the crowd. She looked at Galt, still cradling his stinging hand, saying nothing. She looked back at the stranger. "Yes," she said. He nodded once and turned toward the horses. Clara stepped off the auction block on her own 2 feet, and she didn't look back. They rode hard for 2 hours before Silas let the horses slow. The land changed fast out here. Red Creek sat in a flat basin of dust and dry grass, but the terrain west of town broke open into rough country, rocky ridges, dry creek beds, juniper scrub twisted sideways by decades of wind. By the time the horses dropped to a walk, Clara couldn't see the town anymore. She couldn't see anything behind them but empty land and a sky going gold at the edges. Silas hadn't spoken since they left. He rode slightly ahead of her, scanning the ridgeline every few minutes, with a quiet, automatic habit. His coat was dark with road dust. His hat was pulled low. He hadn't introduced himself. He hadn't explained anything. He had simply pointed her toward a brown mare tied at the rail near the square, and she had climbed up, and they had ridden. Clara had spent the first hour being grateful. She had spent the second hour getting angry. By the time they stopped at a shallow gulch to water the horses, she had worked herself into a full, quiet fury. She dismounted and walked to the edge of the water and crouched down to wash the rope burns on her wrists. The skin was red and raw, the kind of hurt that stings worse when you stop moving, and the adrenaline drains out. She pressed her wet palms together and breathed slow. Silas watered his horse downstream, still not talking. "You're going to tell me something," Clara said. Her voice came out steady. She was glad for that. He didn't look up. "Tonight, no." She stood and turned around. "Now, you walked into that square and threw gold coins at a mayor and put me on a horse. I didn't ask you to do that. I don't know who you are. I don't know where we're going. And I am not going to just follow you through the wilderness in polite silence because you paid money for me, like I was a piece of furniture at an estate sale." Silas looked at her then, a long, measuring look. "Fair," he said. "Start talking." He tied his horse to a juniper branch. He pushed his hat back slightly. "My name is Silas Thorne. I've been trailing the man behind the Red Creek land grab for 4 months. His name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that your father got killed because he mapped something that man once kept secret, a mine, a big one. And somewhere in whatever your father left behind, there's a map or a cipher that shows exactly where it is." Clara went very still. "Your father's compass," Silas said. "You've got it on you. I can see the outline in your pocket. I need it, and I need someone who can read it, because I'm told it's not a standard instrument." She put her hand over her pocket instinctively. "It's my father's. I know. He's dead." "I know that too," he held her gaze. "I'm sorry for it, truly." The apology surprised her. It was plain and quiet, and it landed without any performance behind it. She wasn't sure what she'd expected from a man who shot a gavel out of a mayor's hand. But it wasn't that. She looked at him for a long moment. The sun was dropping now, painting the rocks around them in deep orange. She was tired. She was sore. She had about 17 different fears running through her head simultaneously. And chief among them was that this man, whatever his intentions, was still a stranger who had taken her out into empty country. She made a decision. She would stay awake tonight, and she would wait. They made camp an hour later in a hollow between two limestone outcroppings. Silas built a small fire, low, and contained the kind that gives heat without throwing light too far, and handed her a strip of dried venison and a canteen without being asked. He ate his own meal in silence, staring into the fire. Clara ate and studied him without being obvious about it. He was somewhere in his mid-30s. His face had the weathered, angular quality of a man who had spent most of his life outside, and there were lines around his eyes that came from squinting at distances. His hands were scarred across the knuckles. He moved with an economy that reminded her of a man who had learned to be careful about effort. Nothing wasted, nothing extra. When the fire had burned down to red coals, she made her move. She had found the rock 2 hours earlier, when she'd gone to gather firewood. It was just the right shape flat on one side, with a sharp edge that would cut through. The remaining thread of rope still looped around her left wrist where Silas hadn't fully removed it. She had kept it hidden in her sleeve. Now she worked the edge against the last fiber quietly, steadily, and when it snapped, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the short hunting knife from her own boot, the one Galt's men had somehow missed, and she was across the fire in 3 quick steps. She got the blade to Silas's throat before he fully turned. For 1/2 second, she thought she had him. Then his hand came up so fast she barely tracked it. He caught her wrist, twisted once in a sharp, controlled arc, and the knife spun out of her grip. He was on his feet in the same motion, and she was suddenly pressed back against the limestone, his hand flat on the rock beside her head, the knife on the ground between them. He was breathing hard. So was she. He looked at her not with anger, not with that terrible cold blankness she'd seen on men who were about to hurt someone. He just looked at her. And after a moment, he stepped back. He picked up the knife. He turned it handle first and held it out. She didn't take it right away. "Take it," he said. She took it. He pushed his coat aside, and she saw it then. His shirt had torn at the shoulder in the struggle, and the fabric fell away enough to reveal the left side of his torso. And she forgot everything else for a moment. The scars were old and layered and covered in a pattern so dense and complicated it looked less like injury and more like a language she didn't have the key to. Long marks, short marks, the puckered circles of old bullets. A map of what the world had done to this man over a great many years. He didn't cover himself up. He just stood there and let her look, which was somehow more disarming than anything else he could have done. "Stab me if you want." Angel, his voice was quiet. Not soft. There was nothing soft about it, but quiet. "My blood won't wash this town clean." She said nothing. "I didn't buy you," he said. "I paid to keep you breathing. There's a difference. A man who buys a person thinks he owns something. I know I don't own anything." He held her gaze. "No man has the right to put a price tag on a human soul. Not Galt, not Cord, not me, not anyone." Clara's throat tightened. She pressed her lips together and looked away. "I need your help," he said, "and you have every right to say no. If you want to go back, if you've got somewhere safe to go back to, I'll ride you to the edge of town myself. But Galt will come for you again, and next time, I won't be there." She turned the knife over in her hands once. "You know I don't have anywhere to go," she said. "I know. You knew it when you came for me." "Yes." She looked up at him. "Then, let's be honest with each other from here. No games, no half answers. You tell me what you know, and I'll help you with the compass. But I am not a weapon, and I am not a tool. I'm a person. You treat me like one." Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was more like recognition, the look of a man who understood something he'd already suspected. He said. She kept the knife. He told her his name again. Properly this time, Silas Thorne. Formerly of the 14th Cavalry Regiment. Currently employed as a bounty hunter. though lately the line between employment and obsession had gotten somewhat blurred. He told her he'd been following the trail of missing homesteaders for 2 years. He told her there was a man at the center of all of it. Someone with enough money and enough reach to buy sheriffs and judges and mayors 3 counties wide. He didn't tell her who it was. Not yet. She pulled the compass out and let him look at it without letting go of it. He studied the casing in the firelight, the small, detailed engravings around the rim. The way the needle didn't sit quite right on its axis. Your father modified it, Silas said. He modified everything, Clara said. He was always building things inside other things. He said the best hiding places were the ones nobody thought to look inside. She paused. He also said that a map without a key is just a pretty drawing. Whatever he hid in here, there'll be a cipher somewhere in his papers, in his head, most likely, which is where everything ended up. She closed her fingers around the compass, but I knew how he thought. Give me time. He gave her a long look and nodded. They slept in shifts. Clara took the second watch, sitting with her back against the limestone and the knife across her knees, listening to the wind work its way through the junipers. The stars were enormous out here, the kind you forget exist when you're in town with its lamplight and its noise. Her father had taught her to navigate by them when she was 8 years old. He'd taught her that the sky was just another map, and that if you knew how to read it, you'd never truly be lost. She looked up at them now and thought about what he'd said once, near the end, when something had frightened him enough that he'd started locking his study door at night. Clara girl. Some men build empires. Some men burn them down. The ones who do the burning are the ones to be afraid of, because they don't mind what gets caught in the fire. She hadn't understood it then. She was beginning to understand it now. They broke camp before sunup. Silas was already saddled by the time Clara woke, crouched by the dead fire with a cup of dark coffee he'd somehow produced, and was extending toward her without a word. She took it. She didn't say thank you yet. They were still in the early stages of figuring out what kind of arrangement this was, and she didn't want to be too comfortable, too fast. The coffee was good, which she hadn't expected. She didn't mention that either. They rode east by northeast, away from the main road, keeping to the high ground where Silas could watch the land below. He explained while they rode short sentences. Factual, no embellishment. He told her that Galt would send riders out by mid-morning once he realized the gold wasn't enough to keep him quiet about losing her. He told her the posse would likely be 4 or 5 men, well armed, hired specifically for this kind of tracking work. Have you been chased before? Clara asked. Frequently, by posses, among other things. She wanted to ask what the other things were. She filed it away for later. The land here was rougher than it looked from a distance. What appeared from the ridgeline to be a simple scrub flat was in fact a series of eroded gullies and dry washes, some of them deep enough to swallow a horse. Silas navigated through it without hesitation, picking lines through the terrain that weren't obvious until you were already on them. She kept her eyes on his path and followed. Around mid-morning, she told him about her father. She hadn't planned to. But there was something about riding through open country in early light, with no one else in the world visible in any direction. That made the silence feel like a container, like if you didn't put something real into it, it would just fill up with fear. His name was Robert Hayes, she said. He was a surveyor first, then a cartographer. He worked for the territorial government for 15 years, county lines, water rights, land claims. He was good at it, patient, detail-oriented. She paused. He used to say that a map is a promise. You're telling someone, this is where things are. This is the truth of the land. He took that seriously. Silas listened without interrupting. About 2 years ago, he came home from a survey job out in the Creston Range, and he was different. Quitter. He started writing things in a cipher in his journals. He bought a second lock for his study. He wouldn't tell me what he'd found, but I knew something had shifted. She turned the compass over in her fingers. 3 months later, 2 men came to the house while I was in town. When I got back, he was dead. The study had been torn apart. But they didn't find what they were looking for. Silas said, no, because he'd already moved it, hidden it somewhere in a form they couldn't recognize. She looked at the compass. I've been carrying it for 8 months, without knowing what it is. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he was trying to protect you. If you didn't know, you couldn't be made to tell. I know. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. It was a good plan, except the part where he ended up dead. Silas didn't offer her comfort. He didn't say something hollow about her father being brave or being in a better place. He just rode beside her and let the grief sit in the open air between them, where it could breathe. That was something, she supposed. Some people made loss smaller by putting words all over it. He didn't do that. They were an hour out from the first ridgeline when she heard it. Hoofbeats, coming from the south, moving fast. Silas heard it half a second before her. She saw his shoulders drop and his hand move toward the rifle sling before the sound even fully registered. He looked left, looked right, looked at the terrain. Wash, he said, pointing the deep one now. She didn't argue. She put her heels into the mare and followed him into the dry creek bed, which carved a path between 2 banks of crumbling red earth, easily 8 feet high. They pulled the horses deep into the shadow of an overhang and went still. Clara watched Silas's face. He had gone very quiet in a specific way, not tense, not frozen, but calibrated, like a man running calculations behind his eyes. He tilted his head slightly, counting rhythm in the hoofbeats. 5, he said. Low, maybe 6. Too many to run from in open country. And they both knew it. She could see that understanding pass through him without any drama. He just accepted it, the way you accept bad weather, and started planning around it. Stay behind me, he said. If it goes loud, you ride north. Don't stop for anything. What about compass is more important than I am? You ride. She opened her mouth to argue that she was not going to simply abandon someone who'd been shot on her behalf. But the riders were already close enough to hear individually, and the time for talking was over. They came over the ridge and into the wash from the south end. There were 6 of them. Clara recognized 2 Cord's men from the brothel, with the flat. Patient faces of men who did unpleasant things professionally. The others were strangers to her, but they had the look of hired guns. Well-armed, efficient, nothing personal about any of it. The lead rider spotted them immediately. He pulled up, and the others fanned out in a practiced line. Thorne, the lead man, said, Mayor sends his regards. Give them back, Silas said. The man smiled without warmth and reached for his gun. What happened next moved fast and loud, and Clara's memory of it later came in fragments, the way extreme moments always do. The first shot came from the lead rider, and Silas was already moving sideways off his horse, using the animal's bulk as cover in the same motion. Clara's mare spooked sideways, and she fought the reins, pressing herself flat against the horse's neck. 2 of the hired men swung toward her, and that was a mistake, because it pulled their attention from Silas, and Silas was already repositioning. He moved through that gulch like he'd been born in it. He used the banks, the overhang, the shadows. He was fast and accurate, and completely without hesitation. And Clara watched with a cold, stunned clarity as he worked through those 6 men with a focus that had nothing theatrical about it. He wasn't angry. He wasn't proud of himself. He was doing what was necessary to survive. And the difference between that and cruelty was visible if you looked for it. One of Cord's men broke from the group and came straight for Clara. Silas saw it. He was between 2 of the others, outnumbered and pressed back. And he saw it, and he put himself in the path of an oncoming rider, catching the horse's lead and taking the blow to his shoulder with a grunt that told her exactly how much that hurt, just to break the man's line toward her. He went down to one knee. Clara pulled her horse hard left and bought him 3 seconds. It was enough. He was back up, and it was over in another minute. 2 men down. The rest turned and running north with no stomach left for the fight. Silas stood in the dry creek bed and watched them go, breathing hard, blood coming from a cut above his eyebrow where he'd connected with the rock wall. He walked to Clara's horse and looked up at her. You all right? He said. Yes. She looked at the men on the ground. One was moving. One was not. Are you? He touched the cut on his forehead and looked at his fingers briefly. Close enough. Clara looked at the two men down. She had seen death before her father, a woman from their church who had died in childbirth, an old man who collapsed in the town square on a hot day. But she had never seen it like this, up close and fast and by someone's deliberate hand. She was quiet for a long moment, sorting through what she felt about it. "You didn't kill the one who was coming at me," she said. "You just stopped." Silas looked over. "I shoot people when I have to, not when I don't. Is there a clear line between those two things?" He considered that seriously, which she appreciated. "Most of the time," he said. "Sometimes no. That's the part that doesn't wash off." She looked at him for a long moment. She had decided, somewhere in the middle of those terrifying seconds, that Silas Thorne was not a man who enjoyed violence. He was a man who had made peace with being capable of it, which was a completely different thing. One was a sickness, the other was a sorrow. She handed him the canteen from her saddlebag. He took it, drank, handed it back. They rode on. By the time the sun hit its peak, they were deep enough into the hill country that the flat desert behind them was gone. The terrain was all red rock and cedar now, and the air had dropped enough degrees to be almost bearable. Clara could feel the tension in her shoulders, finally beginning to work itself loose. "The man behind this," she said. "You know who it is." Silas kept his eyes on the trail. "Yes. Are you going to tell me?" A long pause. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because what I'm going to tell you is going to make this feel personal, in a way that changes how you think clearly. And right now, I need you thinking clearly." Clara frowned. "That's a very practiced answer. I've had a while to work on it. It's also somewhat condescending." "I know." He glanced sideways at her. "I'll tell you when we reach Ruby's. You'll want to be somewhere safe when you hear it." She wanted to push, but there was something in the way. He said the name Ruby, a slight softening, barely there, that made her curious about the destination more than the answer. She would wait. She was good at waiting. Her father had taught her that too. "Patience, Clara girl. Maps don't lie, but they make you work for the truth." She pulled the compass from her pocket and held it in her palm while they rode, watching the needle, feeling the slight wrongness in it the way Silas had pointed out. Her father had built something into this instrument, a key or a lock or both. She would find it. That was a promise she was making to herself. And to him. They came down out of the rocks in late afternoon and found the valley. It sat in a natural bowl between two long ridgelines, hidden from every angle until you were nearly on top of it. A small cluster of structures built from salvaged timber and riverstone, with a garden to the south and a spring-fed trough to the north. There was smoke coming from the main chimney. There were chickens in a yard behind the largest building. Two children were chasing each other around a water barrel with the complete, unself-conscious joy of children who had found a safe place and were still celebrating it. Clara stopped her horse and looked at all of it. "This is Ruby's," Silas said. "How many people are here?" "Changes. 14 right now. I think maybe 15. He urged his horse down the slope. "Come on. She'll know we're here already." He was right. By the time they reached the flat ground, the door of the main building was already open, and a woman was standing in it. Mama Ruby was perhaps 60. Perhaps more age sat differently on some people, and on her it sat like seniority rather than decline. She was heavyset and solid, with close-cropped silver hair and eyes that took in the world at a speed Clara found immediately impressive. She wore a practical work dress, brown and worn, and she had a dish towel over one shoulder that she'd clearly forgotten was there. She looked at Silas. "You look terrible," she said. "Good to see you too, Ruby. That cut on your head needs cleaning." Her gaze moved to Clara, and it was neither suspicious nor overly warm. It was the look of a woman who had seen a great many people arrive at her door in various states of ruin and had learned to assess rather than assume. "This is the teacher." "Cartographer," Clara said. Ruby's mouth curved slightly. "Even better." She stepped back from the door. "Come in, both of you. I've got venison stew and cornbread, and you both look like you haven't eaten a real meal in days." "Yesterday morning," Silas admitted. "Lord have mercy." Ruby disappeared back inside. The interior of the building was larger than Clara expected. One main room with a long table, a cooking area, and two smaller rooms built off the back. It was clean and organized in the way that takes real effort to maintain, especially with the number of people Clara could see in various corners. A woman nursing a baby by the far wall, two old men playing cards at the table's end, a teenage boy sharpening a knife by the window. They all looked up when Silas came in, and several faces shifted toward relief, or something close to it. Clara tried to read the room without staring. These were not outlaws. These were people who had been put somewhere they hadn't chosen to be, which was a very different thing. Ruby set bowls on the table and told them both to sit. They sat. She brought bread and poured coffee without being asked. And then she pulled a chair around and sat across from Clara with her hands folded on the table. Silas says your father was Robert Hayes, Ruby said. Yes, I knew of him. Not personally, but two of the men here, the older ones at the end of the table, they came from the Creston Range territory. One of them saw your father out there, doing survey work, about 2 years back. She paused. A week after that, he said, about 50 men arrived from out of nowhere and started marking off land. Didn't ask, didn't file, just started marking. Clara put her spoon down. That's when my father found the mine, if there's a mine. Those men are still out there, Ruby said, and they are not survey workers. She held Clara's gaze. People from that territory have been going missing for 14 months. Homesteaders, mostly. Some immigrants who came out through the Texas Passage and never reached where they were heading. Families. The word sat heavy on the table. Silas had finished his bread and was sitting back slightly, watching Clara absorb this. He wasn't rushing her, wasn't adding anything. He was letting her arrive at the understanding herself, because he clearly knew that information you reach on your own stays with you differently than information someone presses into your hands. She looked at the woman nursing the baby by the wall. The woman was young, maybe 20, and her dress was road-worn, patched at both elbows. The baby was very small. Where did she come from? Clara asked. Quietly, north of the Creston, Ruby said. Husband didn't make it. She walked 4 days with that baby before my people found her on the East Ridge. Ruby unfolded her hands and folded them again, a small controlled gesture. She had nothing, no papers, no money, no name in any official record in this territory. She didn't exist, according to the county. That's how they prefer it. Clara sat with that for a moment. She had grown up in Red Creek. She had taught school there for 3 years. She had believed in the comfortable, surface-level way of someone who hadn't been required to look harder, that the problems she saw were isolated, a corrupt mayor here, a bad man there, localized infections in an otherwise manageable system. What she was starting to understand was that the infection was the system. How long have you been running this place? She asked Ruby. 12 years, Ruby said simply. I was born into slavery. I know what it looks like when someone decides that another person's life is a resource to be used. Her voice was steady and flat, and completely without self-pity. That knowledge does not go away. So when I got free and got land, I did something with both. Clara looked at the room again, the children playing outside, the old men at the table. The baby asleep now against its mother's chest. How do you sustain it? She asked. People help, Ruby said. Travelers leave what they can. Silas leaves what he has. She gave Silas a pointed look, which is sometimes more than he should. Silas said nothing. He thinks I don't know what he does, Ruby said to Clara. He thinks he's subtle. I'm extremely subtle, Silas said. You threw a bag of gold at a mayor in broad daylight. That was calculated. Ruby stood and took their empty bowls. Calculated like a man who doesn't know what to do with money because he doesn't plan on living long enough to spend it. A beat of silence. Silas looked at the table. Clara noticed that. She filed it away, alongside everything else she was collecting about this man. The scars, the coffee that was better than expected, the knife handed back handle first, the way he had stepped into the path of a charging horse to protect her. After supper, Ruby showed Clara to a small room with a cot and a wash basin and a single candle. Clara cleaned the road off herself as best she could. changed into a spare dress that Ruby produced, without explanation from a wooden chest, and then sat on the cot with her father's compass in her hands. She thought about what Silas had said on the trail. "I'll tell you when we reach Ruby's." They were at Ruby's. She stood back up, blew out the candle, and went looking for him. She found him outside, at the far edge of the property, standing near the fence at the north end of the garden. His back was to her. He had his hat off, which she hadn't seen before, and his dark hair was rougher than the hat suggested. He was looking at something in his hand. She approached quietly, not trying to sneak, just not trying to announce herself either. When she was close enough to see what he was holding, she stopped. It was a pocket watch, silver, but the casing was cracked down one side, the crystal face shattered. The hands stopped at a time that no longer meant anything. It wasn't a working timepiece. It was a relic. He held it the way you hold something you can't put down, even though it hurts to keep. He heard her. He didn't startle, she suspected. He had very few startle reflexes left. That they'd been worked out of him a long time ago. He just turned slightly, saw it was her, and didn't hide the watch. He turned it over once and put it in his coat pocket. "You said you'd tell me," she said. He looked out at the dark ridge to the north. The sky was full of stars. Down in the house, she could hear Ruby's voice, low and steady, telling something to someone, a story, maybe, or just instructions. The sound of a person who held things together. Silas was quiet for a long moment. "The man behind this," he said. "The forced labor, the land grabs, the mine, all of it." He paused. "His name is Elias Thorne." Clara waited. "He's my brother," Silas said. The word landed in the dark between them like a stone dropped into deep water. She heard it, turned it over, understood what it cost him to say it out loud. "Older or younger?" she asked. He looked at her sideways, like that wasn't the question he'd expected. "Older. Were you close?" "Once." He looked back at the ridgeline. "A long time ago. We grew up rough. He was the one who took care of things when it needed doing. Took beatings for me when I was small. Took a bullet for me once, when we were older. I owed him in ways that don't have a clean balance." "What happened?" "Money happened," Silas said. "Power happened. It changes people. Sometimes. Doesn't change who they were before, but it changes who they decide to be going forward. And you reach a point where those two people are so far apart, you can't pretend they're the same man anymore." Clara turned that over in her mind. She looked at the compass in her hand, then at him. "Is that why you haven't gone to the marshals?" she said. "You want to face him yourself first." He said nothing for a moment. "Then I want to stop him." "That's the true part. What I want after that," he stopped. "I'm still working on that." She believed him. That was the thing. She had known liars, had grown up around men who said noble things while doing profitable ones. And Silas Thorne didn't have the shape of a liar. He had the shapes of someone carrying something tremendously heavy, in the determined, grinding way of someone who has decided the weight is theirs to bear. "There are people in a mine," she said. "Yes. Families. Yes." She closed her fingers around the compass. Her father's voice was very clear in her head. Just then a map is a promise, and she understood, standing in the dark at the edge of Ruby's garden, that this was what the compass had been waiting for. Not just coordinates, not just a hidden silver vein, a promise to the people her father had known were in danger when he died. "All right," she said. "Show me what you know about the Creston Range, and I'll start on the cipher tonight." Silas turned and looked at her fully for the first time since she'd come out. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to." She kept her voice even. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference. That's what you said, isn't it, when you handed me the knife back?" He was quiet. Then something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile. Not quite, not one. More like a door, opened a centimeter, that had been shut for a very long time. "I'll get the maps," he said. She nodded and followed him back toward the light. Behind them, the stars burned enormous and indifferent over the Creston Range, lighting nothing, promising nothing, simply existing in their ancient and reliable pattern, a map of a different kind, above a land that was very much trying to work out who it belonged to. The answer, Clara thought, was the same answer it had always been. The same answer her father had believed in, enough to die for. It belonged to the people who were brave enough to stay. The storm came without much warning. That was the thing about mountain weather. Down in the flatlands, you could see trouble coming from 50 miles out, a dark wall building on the horizon, giving you time to think, time to plan, time to get yourself somewhere sensible. Up here in the Creston Range, the peaks caught weather systems and held them, rotated them, dropped them on you from directions you weren't watching. 1 hour the sky was pale blue and cold and clear. The next, the clouds had sealed the ridgeline shut, and the wind had teeth. They had been climbing for 2 days. Clara's hands were rough from the rains. Her legs ached in ways she hadn't known legs could ache. The terrain had gotten progressively more punishing loose shale slopes, narrow ledges where the horses had to be led on foot, creek crossings that were already running fast with snowmelt from somewhere higher up. Silas had been navigating by memory, and by the hand-drawn survey notes Clara had cross-referenced, with the cipher she was slowly cracking in her father's compass. It was coming apart, piece by piece, the way all her father's puzzles did, not all at once, but in stages, each answer revealing the shape of the next question. The compass wasn't just modified. The bezel ring had been engraved with a secondary set of coordinates, disguised as decorative scrollwork, that only read correctly when held at a specific angle against a light source. Clara had found it by accident on the second night at Ruby's, when she'd held it up to the candle flame, and the shadow it threw on the wall had produced lines that were absolutely not decorative. Her father had been brilliant. She missed him so much, it was sometimes hard to breathe around the fact of it. She had told Silas about the secondary coordinates that same night, and he had spread his maps across Ruby's table. And they had worked together until nearly dawn, piecing together a route that matched both the survey data and the cipher. The location was real, the mine was real, and it was approximately 3 days' hard ride into the Creston interior, up through a pass the locals called Death Canyon, because of how fast the weather could change there. They were in it now. The snow started as a scatterlight, almost casual, the kind that makes you think it'll pass. By midday, it was serious. By early afternoon, it was a whiteout. The wind driving horizontally across the ledge they were climbing, and Clara could see maybe 15 feet in any direction before the world dissolved into white. Silas called a halt. "We need to find cover," he said. His voice was already rough from the cold. "There's a shepherd's shelter marked on the survey about a quarter-mile ahead, if the snow hasn't taken it down. Can we get the horses there? Have to leave them." He pointed to a cluster of pine trees growing at an angle from the rock face, sheltered enough by an overhang to block the worst of the wind. "Tie them there, take the gear, move on foot." Clara was already dismounting. "Then, let's move." They unpacked what mattered: bedrolls, food, medical kit, the maps, the compass, and distributed it between them in packs. Clara took more than she should have without saying anything. Silas noticed and didn't argue, which she appreciated. They tied the horses securely, made sure they had some protection from the wind, and then they turned into the storm and walked. It was brutal. The footing was treacherous ice forming over loose rock. Every step a negotiation between where you wanted to go and what the ground would allow. The wind was a physical force, not just cold but pushing, trying to walk them sideways off the ledge. Clara kept her head down and watched her feet, and counted steps the way her father had taught her when she was frightened. 1, 2, 3. Just get to 10, then start again. Silas was ahead of her, breaking the wind as much as one person can for another, which wasn't much, but was something. He checked back on her every 20 steps or so, a quick turn, eye contact, a nod, and she returned the nod each time, because she refused to be the first one to show she was struggling. She was struggling. The cold had gotten past her coat, somewhere around the halfway point, and settled into her bones in a way she suspected was going to take a very long time to fully leave. Her fingers had gone past painful into a numb buzzing that worried her more than the pain did. She squeezed them into fists and kept moving. And then she heard it, a sound from Silas that wasn't wind, wasn't footstep, wasn't the creak of pack leather. A short, sharp exhale, and then the sound of someone grabbing at something solid to keep from going down. She looked up. He had stopped. One hand was flat against the rock wall to his left. He was breathing in a controlled pattern that she recognized. It was the rhythm of someone managing pain, directing it, trying not to let it run the situation. His right hand had come up to his left side, without him seeming to intend it. "Silas, keep moving," he said. "What's wrong?" "Old wound." "Keep moving." She came up alongside him and looked at his face. His color was wrong, not the pale of cold, but the gray-white of pain overriding everything else. There was sweat on his forehead, despite the temperature. "Which one?" she said. "Left side." Took a saber cut at Chickamauga. Never healed right. The cold he stopped and breathed again through his nose. Muscles seize up. Happened before. "I can work through it." "How far to the shelter?" 100 yards. Maybe less. "Then put your arm over my shoulders and let's go." Clara Silas. She moved to his left side and pulled his arm across her shoulders before he could protest further. "I am 5 feet and 4 inches tall, and I have been cold for 4 hours, and I do not have the patience for your dignity right now." "Lean," he leaned. Those 100 yards took a long time. Clara had never considered herself especially physically strong. She was athletic in the quiet, functional way of a woman who walked everywhere and carried things and worked a kitchen garden. But she had never tested herself against anything like this, a man who outweighed her by 60 pounds. Half seized with muscle spasms and fighting her every third step out of pride. On an icy ledge in a whiteout, carrying a pack that was pulling her backwards. She thought about her father a lot in those 100 yards. She thought about what he would have done, which was the same thing he always did: put his head down and go one step further than seemed possible, because the step after that was where the answer usually lived. She thought about the woman at Ruby's with the baby, who had walked 4 days alone. She thought about the people in the mine, if they were really there, working in the dark. She took the next step, and the next one. The shelter was a low stone structure built against the rock face, barely large enough for 2 people, with a crude timber door that had warped in its frame, but was still solid. Clara got the door open with her shoulder, while keeping Silas upright against the wall, and then they were inside, out of the wind, and the silence hit her like a physical relief. She got him onto the ground, got the packs off, both of them. Her hands were barely working, but she got the bedroll open and pulled it over him. She found the tinderbox in the side pocket where Silas had shown her it lived on the 2nd day of riding, and she built a fire in the small stone pit in the corner badly, slowly, with hands that didn't want to cooperate. But she built it. It caught on the 3rd try. Then she turned to look at him. He was worse than she'd realized. The cold had triggered something deeper than just muscle spasm. She could see it now in the uneven rise and fall of his breathing, the way the shivering had gone from controlled to involuntary. She had some medical knowledge. Every frontier woman did, out of necessity. She had set a broken finger, stitched a scalp wound, treated burns and fevers and a dislocated shoulder. She had read every medical text in Red Creek's small lending library, because knowledge was one of the few things nobody could take from you once you had it. She knew what infection looked like when it had been living quietly in a body and then got the cold as an ally. "Silas," she touched his forehead. Hot, very hot, underneath the cold surface. "I need to look at the wound. It's scarring, not open. I don't care if it's open. I need to see it." He let her. That alone told her how bad he felt he was past the fighting stage. She got his coat off and his shirt up. The old saber wound was a long, diagonal ridge of scar tissue along his left ribs, fully closed on the surface, but inflamed to a deep, angry red around the edges that told the whole story. The cold had slowed his circulation, and the wound site had responded the way old injuries often did, by pulling resources. Heating up, demanding attention it had been denied too long. She went through the medical kit. Ruby had supplied it, which meant it was better than anything she could have put together. Proper bandaging. A small bottle of carbolic, dried yarrow and bone set. 2 vials of laudanum that she set aside because she needed him conscious enough to tell her if she was making something worse. She treated what she could treat, cleaned the surface, applied a poultice of the yarrow, which would draw the heat and reduce the swelling. Wrapped him tight to keep the warmth in. She fed the fire until the small shelter was genuinely warm, close and smoky but warm, and she pushed water at him every time he surfaced from the fever enough to drink. He was delirious by nightfall. Not wildly, so he wasn't thrashing or screaming. It was quieter than that, and in some ways harder to watch. He surfaced and sank in uneven cycles, sometimes aware of where he was, mostly somewhere else entirely. He said names she didn't recognize. He said, hold the line in a voice that made it clear he was back in a war she'd only read about. Once he said, I'm sorry. Elias, in a tone so raw and unguarded that Clara looked away because it felt like something she had no right to witness. She kept watch. She kept the fire. She checked his temperature every hour by pressing her palm to his forehead, which was not scientific, but was the only instrument she had. Somewhere past midnight, the fever broke. She knew it the moment it happened, the change in his breathing, the way his face lost that drawn, inward expression and simply relaxed. She was sitting against the wall across from him, her knees pulled up, her father's compass in her hand. She had been turning it over and over in the firelight, not looking at it, just needing something to hold. She got up and checked him. The heat had dropped significantly. His color was better. She sat back down, and for the first time since the snow started, she let herself breathe all the way out. Outside, the storm was still howling. Inside, the fire was small and steady. Silas slept the real, deep sleep of someone whose body had been through something serious and was now doing the work of recovery. The shelter smelled like smoke and medicine and cold stone. Clara tipped her head back against the wall and looked at the low ceiling. She had been so afraid, not just of the storm, not just of losing him to the cold or the fever. Something more specific than that, the fear of arriving at the mine without him, of facing whatever was there alone, of failing the people who needed this to work. That fear had been useful. It had kept her moving across that ledge when her body wanted badly to stop. Fear, she thought, was not a weakness. It was information. The problem was only when it became louder than your judgment. Her father had told her that. She could hear his voice clearly, the way you hear the voices of people you've loved once they're gone, not as a memory exactly, but as something more present than that. The compass always points true north. Clara girl, even when you're scared, especially then. She turned the compass over one more time, looked at the star on its face. Then she closed her eyes and let herself rest. In the morning, Silas woke up and immediately tried to sit up too fast and deeply regretted it. He made a sound that was not quite a word and pressed his hand to his ribs and stayed very still for approximately 10 seconds. Don't, Clara said from across the fire, where she was heating water. You had an infected wound and a fever that broke at about 2 in the morning. You need to eat something and drink a lot of water, and not move dramatically for at least an hour. He looked at her. His eyes were clear now, and she could tell he was putting together the night in pieces. You carried me, he said. Helped you. There's a difference. Clara, eat. She handed him a piece of hardtack in the canteen. We can talk about it when you've got some color back. He ate. He drank. He sat with what had happened in the quiet, careful way of a man who was used to being the capable one and was now in the unfamiliar territory of having needed someone. After a while, he said, you built the fire. I did. The aero compress. Ruby's kit. You knew what you were doing. I know how to read, Clara said, and I've had time to read a lot of things. She poured water from the heated pan into 2 cups and handed him one. A frontier woman who doesn't know basic medicine is a frontier woman who loses people she can't afford to lose. I decided a long time ago that wasn't going to be me. Silas looked at her over the cup. I would have died, he said. It wasn't dramatic. It was just factual. Probably not, she said. But you would have been significantly worse. Is that your way of saying you saved my life? It's my way of saying we got through the night. She picked up her own cup, which is what we needed to do. He was quiet for a moment, then low and plain. Thank you. She looked at him. His face was genuine, no performance, no deflection. just a man saying what he meant. "You're welcome," she said. The storm cleared by mid-morning. They stayed in the shelter until noon, then went back for the horses, who had weathered the night in considerably better shape than Silas had, and resumed the climb. Clara rode closer to him than before. She told herself it was practical easier to monitor him from close range. That was true. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was the part she was prepared to look at directly for now. The Creston Range opened up ahead of them, cold and enormous and indifferent to whatever they intended, somewhere in its interior. A mine was running. People were in it. They were coming. The coordinates led them to a canyon. It looked, at first, like most of the Creston geography, a long, narrow cut between two ridgelines, carved by some prehistoric water source that had long since found another route. The walls were dark gray granite, streaked with mineral deposits in bands of rust and ochre. The canyon floor was loose rock and scrub, and a cold wind funneled through it in a steady, low moan, but it smelled wrong. Clara noticed at first a chemical sharpness underneath the cold air, like sulfur, and something else she couldn't name. Silas noticed her noticing. "Blasting powder," he said. "They're still working, now in winter. Silver doesn't care what season it is," he said. "And the men running this operation certainly don't." They left the horses a half-mile back, hobbled in a stand of pine with enough water and hay from the saddlebags to hold them for a day. On foot, they approached along the canyon's east wall, using every shadow and outcropping. Moving slow, Silas had wrapped the metal parts of his rifle with cloth to stop any reflection. Clara had tied down everything on her person that might rattle or catch light. Silas had briefed her the night before. Back at the fire, with the kind of clear, methodical detail she recognized as military training. Cover, stops, what to do at each one. Hand signals for quiet, for stop, for go. He had made her repeat them back until she had them right. Not condescendingly, but practically, the way you teach someone something that actually matters. She had learned them all in 20 minutes, which had produced a brief expression on his face that she was beginning to recognize as the version of impressed he was willing to show. At the first stop, a large boulder 50 yards from the canyon entrance, they observed. The operation was larger than either of them had extrapolated from the maps. The mine entrance itself was a tunnel cut directly into the canyon wall, shored with heavy timber, maybe 15 feet wide and 10 feet high. Ore carts moved on a single rail track that ran from the tunnel mouth to a processing area 20 yards, out a rough structure of timber and corrugated metal, where the ore was crushed and sorted. The sound of the crusher was a continuous low grinding that explained why you could hear nothing from outside the canyon. Guards. Clara counted 4 on the exterior 2 at the mine entrance, one walking the perimeter at irregular intervals, one stationed at a wooden structure to the south that was either a barracks or a storage shed. All 4 were armed. All 4 had the unhurried, habitual attentiveness of men who had been doing this long enough to not be nervous about it anymore, which was in some ways more dangerous than men who were nervous. Inside the processing area, she could see workers, 11, 12. She was still counting when Silas put his hand briefly on her arm and pointed to the mouth of the tunnel. A group was coming out. They came in a line, single file, each one attached to the next by a length of chain. Men, mostly gaunt and dust-covered, wearing what had once been regular clothing and was now rags held together by habit. Their movements were the movements of people who had been doing hard physical labor for a long time on not enough food. Deliberate, economical, no wasted motion anywhere. Behind them, a guard with a rifle. Clara looked at every face she could see. Farmers, she thought. Working men. Immigrants. Several of them, she could see it in the features, the varied physiognomy of people who had come to this territory from other places and other worlds, with some hope in hand. Men who had been reported missing, to sheriffs who had done nothing, because doing nothing was what they'd been paid to do. She felt rage. It arrived cleanly, without heat or cold. Purposeful fury that was nothing like the panicked anger of being afraid. This was different. This was the anger of clarity, of looking at something and understanding exactly what it was and refusing to look away from it or soften it or find a way to make it more bearable than it actually was. These men had been taken. They were being used. They were being worked until they were finished, and they had been rendered invisible by a system built specifically to ensure that nobody with any power to stop it would ever see them. Silas beside her was absolutely still. She looked at his face and saw the same thing she felt. Wrapped in a different expression, his jaw set, his eyes working through the count and the layout and the angles. Grief and fury and calculation running simultaneously. How many total, do you think? She asked, voice barely above a breath. Based on that group, 30, maybe 40 inside. 40 people, at least. She looked at the chain between the workers. She looked at the guard's rifle. She looked at the timber shoring of the mine entrance, and then at the slope above it. And then she began thinking about engineering, about load-bearing structures, about what happened to a tunnel when its supports were compromised in a controlled way. Silas, she said. I see it, he said. If we could get inside. We get the people out first, then the entrance, in that order. We need to know the layout. I know some of it. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat, a partial map of the canyon, marked with notes in his own handwriting. Ruby's people. One man escaped 3 months back. He drew what he remembered before the fever took him. He spread it flat on the rock between them. Main tunnel runs east for about 200 yards. Then branches. Prisoners are kept in the south branch at night, a cutout in the rock. Locked gate. North branch is where they keep the ore before carting. Guards inside. 2 at night. More during working hours. So we need to wait for nightfall. We need to do more than wait. He looked at her directly. There's a second entrance. East side of the canyon. Up on the ridge, an old ventilation shaft the original diggers put in before the current operation took over. It's narrow. Too narrow for me. He held her gaze. It might not be too narrow for you. Clara looked at the ridge, looked at him, looked at the mine entrance with its guards and its chain and its 30 or 40 invisible people. Tell me everything the escaped man said about the South Branch, she said. They spent the rest of the daylight hours planning. She learned the layout until she could sketch it from memory. She learned the guard rotation that Silas had pieced together from observation irregular, intentionally so, but with patterns inside the irregularity that a cartographer's trained eye for pattern could unpick. She learned the location of the locked gate and what she'd need to get through it, a specific type of pin lock that Silas showed her how to deal with using a piece of bent wire and patience. He taught her how to move in confined spaces. Low, slow, weight distributed to avoid sound. She practiced it in the shadow of the boulder until he was satisfied. He showed her the hand signal for abort, 3 quick taps on any surface, and made her promise to use it if anything went wrong inside, without waiting to see if she could fix it. I mean it, he said. I know you mean it. Clara, I promise, she said, and she meant it, with the private amendment that she would define wrong very specifically and not generously. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. Then he looked away. Night came slowly in the canyon. The torches at the mine entrance were lit when the last light failed 6 of them, throwing orange light in a ring around the operation. The crusher had gone quiet 2 hours before dark. The ore carts sat still on their rails. The exterior guards had changed once, and Clara had counted the interval down to the minute. She had the wire in her pocket. She had a small dark lantern, shielded on 3 sides that Silas had produced from the pack. She had the map in her head. At the signal Silas's hand dropping flat, she moved. The ventilation shaft was where he'd said it was, accessible from the canyon's east ridge by a 40-foot climb that was difficult but doable. She had done harder. The shaft itself was narrow. She fit through it with perhaps 3 inches of clearance at the shoulders, and it dropped at a steep angle into the rock. For what she estimated was 30 feet before leveling off. She went down feet first, using her back against one side and her boots against the other, the way Silas had shown her, controlling the descent. The stone was cold through her coat. Her breathing sounded very loud in the dark. At the bottom, She opened the lantern's single narrow slit and oriented herself. The south branch was 30 yards to her left. She moved. The inside of the mine was nothing like she had imagined, and she had spent considerable time imagining it. It was tighter and lower. For one thing, she'd expected industrial height. But the ceilings were irregular, carved to the shape of the ore vein rather than to human comfort. It was also louder with silence than it should have been, echoing, amplifying every small sound, the drip of water somewhere deep, the distant shift of rock, in a way that made her intensely aware of her own footsteps. She found the gate. It was iron, set into the rock, with a chain and the pin lock Silas had described. She crouched in front of it and worked the wire with fingers that were cold and not fully cooperative. And she took 3 attempts, and what felt like 10 years, but was probably 90 seconds before the lock gave. She pushed the gate open. It was heavy, and it swung without squeaking, which told her someone maintained it, which told her other things she didn't want to think about right now. The south branch opened up after 5 yards into a larger cut, a rough, organic space where the rock had been widened deliberately, with a low ceiling and a dirt floor. 37 people. She counted them in the near dark before she opened the lantern wider, because she wanted to know the number. 37. They were awake, or most of them were not sleeping, but in that suspended state of people who have learned to conserve every available resource, including consciousness, lying or sitting in the dark in almost complete stillness. When her lantern light hit them, the nearest man flinched back hard, pulling others with him by reflex. "Wait," she said. She kept her voice at a breath. "I'm not with them. I'm here to get you out, but you have to be completely quiet." Nobody moved. She looked at the nearest man, older, weathered, with dust worked so deep into the lines of his face it had become part of him. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Suspicion, exhaustion, underneath both of those. Fragile and careful, and very much alive. Something like hope. She held up the wire she'd used on the lock. "There's a man on the outside. He's dealing with the guards. I need you to trust me for about 20 minutes, and I need you to move very quietly. Can you do that?" The old man looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. She got the chains off the ones who were chained. It took time. The locks were simple, but there were many of them, and her hands were clumsy with cold and urgency. She talked while she worked, barely above a whisper, telling them the route, telling them what Silas would have done with the exterior guards by now, telling them where the horses were, and that there were people waiting who would help them. She said the name Ruby, and she saw 2 men look at each other in a way that suggested they had heard it before, that it was a name that meant something, that it had been kept alive in here like a coal kept alive under ash, something small and persistent that had refused to go out. She had them moving in 8 minutes. That was when it went wrong. A guard at the tunnel junction, not on the rotation schedule, not where he should have been. Stationed there for reasons she would never know. He had a torch and a rifle, and he turned the corner into the South Branch corridor as the first of the freed prisoners were moving through it. For 1 second, nobody moved. Then Clara picked up a rock from the ground. She threw it hard and accurate at the torch. She had been throwing rocks since she was 6 years old at fence posts, at tree trunks, at the distant cutout targets, targets her father set up for her in the field, because he thought a person should be able to hit what they aimed at. The torch went out. The guard shouted. Chaos broke out in the dark. She yelled, actually yelled. Full voice move. Go, go now. They moved. She moved with them, pressing toward the tunnel entrance. And behind her, she heard a second shout. Then gunfire from outside. Then Silas's voice cutting through the noise in a flat, carrying command that she couldn't hear the words of, but felt the effect of immediately. The panicked scramble ahead of her organized, slightly, into a direction. The tunnel entrance was chaos and firelight and running. Silas was at the mouth, and she didn't fully understand what he'd done to the exterior guards, but there were only 2 standing, one of them, Silas himself, and one of them a guard with his hands raised, who had clearly made a quick calculation about his odds. The freed prisoners poured out into the canyon. She was counting as they passed her. 31, 32. Silas appeared at her shoulder. She knew it was him before she saw him, the specific weight of that presence she'd been tracking for days without meaning to. "We need to blow the entrance," he said. "South Branch is clear. Any workers still inside?" One. He wouldn't come. She looked at the tunnel, and the grief of that would have to wait. Old man wouldn't move. Silas's jaw worked. "Then we do it with the North Branch intact. Mining can resume eventually. The point is to stop it for now. Seal the entrance. Make it cost them time." He looked at the timber shoring she'd already identified from outside. "I've got the powder. How much time do we have?" "Not much." He looked at her. A fast, direct look. "Get the people to the horses. All 30-some of them, and 2 horses. It'll be slow going. But Ruby's people will meet you on the East Ridge. I arranged it before we came in." "You arranged it?" "I've been planning this for 4 months. She would be impressed later. Right now. And you, I'll be behind you." He held her gaze. 3 minutes behind you. "I promise." She believed him, and she didn't entirely want to, because believing people was how you got hurt. But she also understood that this was a moment that required trust more than it required self-protection. And she had made herself a rule about letting fear make decisions for her. She turned and pushed through the crowd, organizing the movement with her hands and her voice, pointing, directing, getting them moving east toward the ridge. They were exhausted and disoriented, but they were moving, which was the only thing that mattered. She was 70 yards up the slope when the explosion happened. It wasn't massive, not dramatic, not the cinematic roar of an action. It was a heavy, concussive thump that rolled through the canyon walls and sent a cloud of rock dust billowing out from the mine entrance, followed by a sound like a long exhalation as the timber shoring gave way and the tunnel sealed itself in a controlled, deliberate collapse. She stopped and turned. The dust was thick in the torchlight. She counted seconds. At 30, a figure came through the dust at a run, dark coat, hat gone, moving with his left hand against his ribs in a way that told her the shoulder wound from earlier was making itself known again. She breathed out. He came up the slope and fell into step beside her without breaking pace. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." "What happened?" "Argument with a timber." He glanced sideways at her. The other guy lost. She looked at him. His face was gray with dust, and there was blood tracking down his left arm from somewhere near the shoulder. And he was keeping pace with her, up a rocky slope in the dark, while managing an old war wound and a new injury. He was also, she observed, not dead, which she had been quietly terrified about for the last 4 minutes in a way she was choosing not to examine closely. "Ruby's people," she said. "East Ridge, 30 minutes out." "Can you make 30 minutes?" He looked at her sideways. "Can you stop asking me that?" "No," she said. Behind them, 37 people climbed toward the ridgeline in the dark, toward something that was neither a full rescue nor a complete victory, just an open door, and the night, and the next step forward, above them. The stars were enormous and clear after the storm, and the Creston Range was cold and silent and utterly indifferent. But the mine was closed. The people in it were out, and Clara Hayes had kept her promise. The descent from the Creston took 3 days. 3 days of moving 37 exhausted people through rough country on 2 horses, in cold that was determined but no longer vicious, on rations that were insufficient but not quite desperate. Clara and Silas walked the whole way. The horses were shared between the worst off 2 older men who had been in the mine longest, a teenager with a badly infected foot, 2 others whose condition the cold had made critical. Ruby's people met them on the East Ridge, exactly where Silas had said they would, with mules and blankets, and enough food to take the edge off the immediate crisis. And the group absorbed the relief of that in a silence that was deeper than words. Clara moved through those 3 days in a focused, operational state. She tended wounds during rest stops. She helped carry people when they needed it. She kept her count, all 37, every rest stop, every morning, like a quiet personal ritual, because she had brought 37 people out of that tunnel, and 37 people were going to arrive at Ruby's. They did. Ruby had prepared the valley as if she'd known exactly what was coming, which in the practical sense, Silas had sent a rider ahead on the second day of descent. Every available sleeping space was arranged. Water was hot. Food was ready. Ruby stood at the door of the main building when the group came down the slope into the valley, and she watched them come with an expression that Clara had no word for, something between grief and gratitude, and a calm, burning anger that she wore the way other people wear conviction. The two women didn't say anything to each other at first. Ruby just looked at the group, the gaunt faces, the road-wrecked bodies, the teenagers who should have been home somewhere, the old men who might never fully recover. And then she turned and got to work, which was, Clara had come to understand, how Ruby expressed most of the things she felt most strongly. Clara worked alongside her through the first evening and into the night. She had stopped keeping track of which tasks she was doing. It was all one continuous motion. One thing, and then the next, and then the next. Somewhere past midnight, Ruby pressed a cup of tea into her hands and made her sit down at the long table. And Clara sat and didn't argue. He needs that shoulder looked at, Ruby said, tilting her head toward the back of the room where Silas was sitting against the wall with his coat off, letting one of Ruby's people bandage the wound. I know, Clara said. You've been watching him all evening, without looking like you're watching him. I'm monitoring his condition. Ruby made a sound that was almost amusement, if that's what we're calling it. She sat across from Clara and folded her hands on the table. He took a bullet, fragment, from the timber at the mine entrance. It wasn't a direct shot, more like shrapnel from the blast. Clara turned the teacup in her hands. He didn't tell me about it until we'd been walking for an hour. He never tells anyone anything until he's decided it can't wait anymore, Ruby said. He's been that way since the first time he came through here, 3 years ago, then again 2 years ago, then last month. He paused, each time a little more worn down, each time with a little more of himself left behind somewhere on the trail. Clara looked across the room at him. He had his head tipped back against the wall, his eyes closed while the bandaging was finished. The room around him was full of people he'd put himself in the path of danger to help, and he looked like a man sitting alone in an empty space. He carries a broken pocket watch, Clara said. Ruby nodded slowly. He had a family, Clara said. It wasn't quite a question, wife. Son, Ruby's voice was quiet. Both gone. His brother's men. 3 years back. Elias didn't pull the trigger himself. Men like Elias never pull the trigger themselves, but it was his doing. When Silas got too close to the operation the first time and needed to be redirected, she looked at Clara directly. He doesn't talk about it. I know he doesn't. But he will. Someday. With the right person. Ruby looked at her for a moment with those quick, assessing eyes. He brought you here. That's the first time he's brought anyone here who wasn't a refugee. Clara said nothing. She looked at the teacup. I'm just making an observation, Ruby said, and stood up and went back to work. Clara sat with the tea for another minute. Then she stood, picked it up, and walked across the room. Silas opened his eyes when she was still 4 feet away. He did that, tracked her approach before she was visible, which she suspected was a habit of survival that had become automatic enough that he probably didn't notice it anymore. She sat down next to him on the bench. She handed him the tea. He took it. They sat for a while in the noise and warmth of the main room, surrounded by 37 people, eating and sleeping, and slowly beginning to reassemble themselves from what had been done to them. The fire was large. The room smelled like venison stew and pine smoke, and the particular human smell of too many people in a warm space, which Clara had never in her life been so grateful for. 37, Silas said. Every one of them, she said. He nodded. He looked into the teacup. One man wouldn't come. I know. She had been living with that since the mine. He'd been there too long. Whatever that place was for him, it had become what he knew. That happens to people sometimes. Fear of the known and the fear of the unknown. And sometimes the known wins. We could go back for him. The entrance is sealed. There are other ways in. Silas, she said his name in a way that meant stop. You were right. We got the people out first. We can go back. We will go back. But not tonight. He looked at her. She held the look. After a moment, he lowered his eyes back to the cup. "You're right," he said. "Simple. No performance." "I know," she said, with the same directness he'd used, and heard him make a sound that was almost a laugh. She hadn't heard that from him before. It was brief, a single quiet exhale of something genuine, and it changed his face in a way that surprised her. The way a sudden shift in light changes a landscape. You thought you understood. The next morning, Clara opened the ledgers. Silas had taken them from the mine's processing office during the chaos, a set of cloth-bound books that recorded, in a meticulous clerical hand, the full scope of the operation. Entry dates, names, work assignments, production weights. It was the record of a business, detailed and orderly. And the fact that the business was the organized theft of human lives made every carefully penned number in it a piece of evidence. She spread them across Ruby's big table and went through them methodically while Silas ate breakfast across from her, and Ruby's people moved around them in their morning routines. The ledgers told the story completely. Every name, every date. The chain of payments from the mine operation back through a series of intermediary accounts to a single source. The payments to Galt, the payments to the hired guns, the payments to sheriffs in 3 counties who had looked the other way when families reported their people missing. And there, on the last page of the final ledger, in a hand different from the meticulous clerk's, a bold, decisive script. The writing of a man accustomed to authority, a signature on what appeared to be an operating charter. Elias Thorne. Clara looked at the name for a long time. Then she looked at Silas. He was already watching her. He had seen what she was looking at. "It's enough," she said, "for the marshals." "Yes, and for you." He set down his fork. He looked at the ledger, and at the name, and at whatever was in the middle distance behind all of that. "I told you once I was still working on the part after we stop him." "You did. I think I've been working on it under the assumption that stopping him and facing him were the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "They're not." "No," she said. "They're not." He looked at her. "He needs to face legal consequences. Whatever he did to my family, whatever he's done to everyone. In this valley and in that mine, it doesn't get solved by me settling it personally. It gets solved by evidence and courts and a process that treats the people he harmed as people worth protecting, not just as witnesses to someone else's story." He paused. "I've known that for a while. I just kept letting it get crowded out by the other thing." "The rage," she said. "Yes. That's an honest thing to say about yourself. I've had a lot of trail time to think." His mouth made that near smile. "And recently I've had company that asks direct questions." She looked down at the ledger. "We take these to the federal marshals. Together. And we take the testimony of every person in this valley who's willing to give it." She looked up. "Elias Thorne will be done. Not by a bullet, by the record of what he actually did." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "My brother once told me," he said, slowly, "that the difference between powerful men and powerless ones was that powerful men controlled what got written down." He believed it completely. He looked at the ledger. He kept meticulous records of everything he did because it never occurred to him that the records might end up in someone else's hands. "His own pride," Clara said. "His own pride." She closed the ledger and stacked it with the others. "We leave for Red Creek in 2 days. You need 1 more day of rest, whether you'll admit it or not. And these people need at least that long to recover enough to give testimony." She looked at him directly. "Do you have people in Red Creek? Anyone who can be trusted to receive us?" "There's a postal rider named Deacon who runs the eastern route. He's been working with me for 8 months. He can get a message to the federal marshal's office in Santa Fe before we arrive." "Good," she stood. "Then we have 2 days." He looked up at her. She picked up her father's compass from the table and turned it over once in her hand. The cipher was fully decoded now, had been since the 3rd night at Ruby's, when the last piece of her father's pattern had clicked into place. The coordinates it gave were exactly the coordinates of the canyon. Her father had known. He had mapped the mine, disguised the map, hidden it in the one object he knew Clara would keep, and trusted his daughter's mind to find what he'd left her. She pressed the compass flat against her palm. A map is a promise. She looked around Ruby's main room, at the freed miners eating breakfast, at the children playing near the fire, at Ruby herself moving through the space with that quiet, total authority, at the 37 people who were here because something had gone right in a situation where most things go wrong. My father mapped this, she said, to no one in particular, or maybe to him. He found it, and he knew what it was, and he hid the location rather than let it be used to hurt people. He spent the last months of his life trying to keep this secret in the right hands. It's in the right hands, Silas said. She looked at him. He held her gaze, and in the quiet between them, in the smoke and warmth of that room, in the noise of 37 lives continuing something past that they both understood, and neither of them said aloud yet, because some things are true for a while before they're ready to be spoken. She put the compass back in her pocket. 2 days, she said. 2 days, he agreed. Outside, the Creston Range stood cold and enormous and permanent, its peaks cutting the sky into pieces. The mine entrance was sealed. The ledgers were on the table. The names were written down. And in Ruby's Valley, 37 people ate breakfast in a warm room, which was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything. The cave was Silas's idea. They had been riding for 6 hours when the weather turned again, not the killing blizzard of the Creston. Just a hard, cold rain that came out of a low sky and soaked through everything within 20 minutes. The trail back toward Red Creek ran through open country. An open country in that kind of rain was miserable and exposed, and, more practically, left tracks that anyone following them could read without much effort. Silas knew the cave from an earlier trip through this part of the territory. He said it without elaborating. And Clara had learned by now that there were a great many places Silas knew from earlier trips through various territories, and that asking about all of them would take longer than she had. She filed the question away and followed him up a switchback through the pines to a limestone shelf where the rock face had opened into a long, low cavity wide enough at the entrance to walk in upright, deep enough to shelter both people and horses from the rain, with a natural chimney crack in the ceiling that would vent a small fire. They got the horses in, got a fire going, spread their wet gear across whatever flat rock was available. Then Clara set Silas down and looked at his shoulder. The wound had been properly treated at Ruby's cleaned, sutured by one of Ruby's people who had the steadier hands for it, bandaged. But 2 days of riding had worked on it, and the bandage needed changing, and the area around the sutures was showing enough inflammation that she wanted to see it in good light before they got any closer to Red Creek. Sit forward, she said. He sat forward. She unwound the bandage carefully. The sutures were holding good. Clean work, but the skin around the wound was raised and hot under her fingertips, telling her the body was still in active dispute about how it felt about all of this. It needs to stay dry, she said. We should stay here tonight. We have time, he said. Deacon will have gotten word to the marshals by now. A day won't change the timeline. She worked with the carbolic and the clean bandaging she'd repacked at Ruby's. She was aware of the proximity, the particular, specific awareness of being close to someone in a small, warm, firelit space when you've been in each other's company long enough to know all the ordinary versions of their presence and are now encountering a different one. He was very still while she worked, she thought. At first, it was pain management, but the wound wasn't that bad. He was still because he was paying attention to her hands, to her face, to the way she worked focused, efficient, talking through what she was doing in a low voice, the way she'd done during the fever in the shepherd's shelter. She had finished rebandaging and was starting to secure the cloth when her fingers moved, without her fully directing them, along the edge of the scar tissue that ran from the wound outward toward his spine. Old scarring, deep, layered over years. She felt him go still in a different way. She looked at what her hands were doing, and then she made a choice and kept doing it. She was a cartographer. She read the shape of things, and the shape of this man's back was a record of a life lived at the edge of what people can endure. written in the only medium that had been available. My father used to say, she said quietly, that every mountain has its fault lines, the places where the rock broke under pressure, and then healed over and became stronger than the parts that never broke. She traced a long, diagonal line of scarring with 2 fingers. He said you could always find the fault lines if you knew how to look, that they were the map of everything the mountain had survived. Silas said nothing. He was listening in that complete way of his. Your body is just a map of pain, she said. Everything you survived. Everything that tried to stop you and didn't. She paused. It's not something to hide. He turned his head slightly, not looking back at her directly, but angled enough that she could see his profile against the firelight. Most people, he said, when they see them, they look away. I'm not looking away. A silence. The fire moved. Rain hit the rock outside the cave entrance in a curtain of steady sound, he said, slowly. My wife used to say I carried the war home in my skin, that she could feel it. When she touched me, all the places where the person I'd been before had gotten replaced by something harder. He stopped for a moment. She meant it with love. She always meant things with love, but she was right. The man who came back from the war wasn't entirely the man she'd married. Clara kept her hand still on his back. She didn't speak. When she died, he stopped again, started again differently. I stopped trying to be the before-war version. I stopped trying to be any particular version. I just became whatever the next thing needed me to be. A tracker, a bounty hunter, a man with a rifle and a mission and nothing else scheduled. That's not living, Clara said. That's surviving. For a while, they're the same thing. They're not, though. She moved around to sit beside him, where she could see his face. His eyes were on the fire, and they were tired, that deep tiredness she'd seen since the first night in camp. The kind you can't address by sleeping. I know what it is to decide that living small is safer, to keep yourself inside the boundaries of what you can control. Because everything outside it has already proved it can hurt you. She looked at the compass in her coat pocket, felt the familiar weight of it. I taught school for 3 years after my father died. I stood in that schoolroom every day, and I was good at it, and I felt absolutely nothing. He turned and looked at her. I was hiding, she said, in plain sight, in work and routine, and the illusion of usefulness. My father got killed for mapping the truth, so I stopped mapping anything true. I drew county lines and property boundaries and asked nothing of myself until Galt put you on a block. Until Galt put me on a block. She held his gaze. And I realized that hiding doesn't keep you safe. It just makes you invisible when they come for you anyway. Silas looked at her for a long moment. The firelight shifted across his face, and she could see the exact moment he decided to say the thing he'd been not saying for the better part of 10 days. I'm afraid, he said, of finding out that everything I've done since I lost them every mile, and every fight, and every decision added up to nothing. That I got close to stopping Elias 3 different times and failed, and that the cost of those failures was paid by people who had nothing to do with my family's story. He paused. I'm afraid of being responsible for that in a way I can't undo. You can't undo it, Clara said. That's true. He looked at her. But you can stand next to it, honestly, instead of running faster than it can follow. She kept her voice steady. You can say this happened, and people were hurt, and I didn't stop it in time, and I am going to make sure it stops now. That's not the same as undoing it, but it's real. And real is the only thing that actually helps. He was quiet for a long time. You're an extraordinary person, he said, not as a compliment, as an observation. The same way he'd say there are 6 riders factual, direct, without embellishment. I have good teachers, she said. Your father? And others. She held his gaze. Recently, something shifted in his expression, the same door she'd seen open a centimeter in the firelight at Ruby's. This time it opened further. This time he let it. He reached up and touched her face. His hand was rough and careful, and he held it against her jaw like she was something he was learning the shape of by touch. She stayed still and let him. He was looking at her with that direct, unguarded attention he usually kept turned toward the horizon, and receiving it full on was more than she'd prepared herself for. I have been, he said slowly, trying very hard to not be the kind of man who pulls someone into his particular storm. I know, she said. I've watched you doing it. It's a significant storm, I've noticed. Clara Silas. She put her hand over his, where it rested against her face. I walked into the storm on my own. You didn't pull me anywhere. I made a choice on that auction block, and I've kept making it every day since. She paused. I am a grown woman who has survived an auction, a possus, a blizzard, a silver mine, and you're cooking. I think I can assess my own risk tolerance. He laughed. Actually laughed a real one this time. Full breath. Surprised out of him. And it changed his whole face. Took 10 years off it. Showed her something of the man who had existed before the war and the losses. Alive and still present underneath all that worn-down exterior. She wanted to keep seeing it. He kissed her, or she kissed him. Later, she would not be entirely sure which of them moved first. Only that the distance between them went from inches to nothing in a single, definitive moment. It was not tentative. They had been through too much for tentative. It was the kiss of two people who had been paying close attention to each other for 10 days, and had a great deal to say, and had only just found the right language. When they pulled apart, the rain was still falling, and the fire was still burning, and they were both breathing differently than they had been before. He pressed his forehead to hers. I have been thinking, he said, about what it might feel like to stop moving. And terrifying, he said. Also, the first thing in years that feels like it might be worth the terror. She pulled back enough to see his face. We still have to go to Red Creek, I know. And face your brother, I know. And deliver evidence to the federal marshals. And make sure 40 people get their testimony heard. And Galt gets arrested, and the mine gets properly shut down. And Clara, yes, I know. He looked at her with that steady, tired, entirely genuine expression. All of it. We do all of it. And then he paused. And then I'd like to stop. She looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said simply. They kept watching shifts again that night. Clara sat by the fire in the small hours and worked on her maps, proper ones now, drawn on good paper from Ruby's store, documenting the mine's location, the canyon geography, the route in and out, evidence, documentation, the truth of the land, recorded in a hand that knew what it was doing. Her father's compass sat open beside her. She did not feel his absence the way she had in the early months, that raw, tearing feeling that arrived without warning. She felt something different now, his presence, maybe, the sense of a job given and a job being done. She drew the last line on the canyon map and thought, this is what you left me the compass for, she thought. I see it, Papa. I see the whole picture. She rolled the map carefully and added it to the bundle of ledgers and documents they were carrying to Red Creek. Then she sat back and looked at Silas asleep against the cave wall, his hat over his face, his breathing deep and even. And she thought about what he had said about stopping. She thought it sounded like the most honest thing she had ever heard. They came into Red Creek from the north, Silas's instinct, and Clara agreed with it. The north road came in behind the livery stable and the feed merchant, the working end of town, where people were occupied with practical things and not looking up much. They rode in at mid-morning on a Wednesday, which was market day, which meant the main street would be busy, and busy crowds were useful for people who needed to arrive without arriving loudly. Deacon had done his job. Silas found the chalk mark on the post outside the postal office, a simple horizontal line that meant message received and sent. And some of the tension in his shoulders went down a degree or two. The federal marshals had gotten word. They were either already in the territory or on their way. The question was whether Elias had gotten word, too. They had taken rooms at the small boarding house on the north side of town, run by a widow named Mrs. Parrish, who asked no questions and accepted payment in advance. Clara unpacked the documents on the small desk in her room ledgers, maps, the full cipher record, the signed operating charter with Elias's signature, and organized them with the methodical care she gave to every important document. A map is a promise. Evidence is a different kind of promise. A record of what happened so that it can be answered for. Silas came and stood in the doorway. He's here, he said. She looked up. Deacon's second mark, on the livery post. He looked at the wall, not at her. Elias arrived 2 days ago. He's been at the Galt house. He knew we were coming. He's been expecting this for a while. Silas paused. He's not stupid. He knows what we have. He'll have been counting on one thing to change the odds. You, Clara said me. She looked at him. His face was closed in a way it only got when he was working through something he hadn't fully worked out yet. She gave him time. She had learned that he arrived at the important conclusions on his own schedule, and that waiting him out was more useful than pushing. Whatever he says to you, she said. When we face him, I need you to hear it. And then remember what's in these ledgers. I know what's in the ledgers. I know, you know. But when he talks, she kept her voice even. He's been building his case for years. He knows exactly which doors in you to knock on. He's your brother, and he spent a long time being someone you loved and trusted. Those levers don't just stop working because you want them to. Silas looked at her. You're telling me to be careful of my own weakness. I'm telling you that knowing your weakness exists is what makes you stronger than it. She turned back to the documents. I'm also telling you that I will be standing right next to you. And if he starts working on you, and I see it happening, I'm going to say something. A beat of silence. You're going to argue with my brother in the middle of a confrontation, he said. I'm going to speak clearly and directly in a moment that requires it. There's a difference. She stacked the last of the ledgers, which is something someone told me once. He made that sound again, that quiet, brief exhale of genuine amusement. Then he went to check the position of the federal marshals. The marshals arrived in Red Creek that afternoon, 2 of them men, with that particular, unhurried authority of people whose jurisdiction is federal rather than county, which meant they didn't owe anything to Galt or to Elias, or to the web of payments those 2 had spent years weaving through the local power structure. They met with Silas in a room at the back of the postal office, and Clara was there. And she laid out the evidence with the same methodical precision she used for everything that mattered. She watched the marshals go through the ledgers, watched them find the names, the dates, the payments, the signed charter. She watched the moment each of them understood, independently and clearly, what they were looking at. Where's the primary witness population? The senior marshal asked. A way station called Ruby's, 2 days east, Silas said. 37 people, most of whom were imprisoned in the mine. 3 of them previously testified to missing family members to local sheriff's offices and received no response. He paused. The reason they received no response is also documented. The marshal looked at the payment records for the sheriff's offices and said something quiet and pointed that Clara agreed with completely. We'll need another 2 days before we can make the arrests, the marshal said. We need to get a rider to the circuit judge and establish the warrant chain correctly. If this goes to trial, and it will go to trial, we want nothing thrown out on procedure. 2 days, Silas said. He looked at Clara. She nodded. 2 days. They could manage 2 days. They managed one. On the second morning, she was coming down the boarding house stairs with the organized evidence bundle when she heard the voice in the front room. Even without knowing it, she knew it, the particular authority of it, the way it assumed its right to take up space. She stopped on the last step and listened. Mrs. Parrish, the voice said, pleasant and deliberate. I believe you have 2 guests registered, a man and a woman. I'd like to speak with them. Clara came down the last step and into the front room. He was tall, older than Silas by perhaps 6 years, which put him in his early 40s. He had Silas's coloring, but worn differently, dressed expensively, clean-shaved, with none of the road-worn quality of his brother. His eyes were the same dark brown, but the expression in them was different. Silas's eyes were tired and careful and essentially honest. Elias Thorne's eyes were the eyes of a man who was always, simultaneously, conducting 2 separate conversations, the one you could hear and the one you couldn't. He looked at Clara with an assessment that lasted less than 2 seconds, and told her he had decided what she was and what she represented in about that same amount of time. Miss Hayes, he said, I've heard a great deal about you. Your father was a talented man. He was, she said. Unfortunate. What happened to him? Unfortunate is one word for it. He smiled. It was a practiced smile, warm on the surface. Nothing behind it. I wonder if I might speak with my brother. You can speak with both of us, she said. Or you can speak with neither of us. Those are the available options. The smile didn't waver. Both of you. Then Silas was in the doorway at the back of the room. He had come down the back stair, silent as always, and he had been standing there for some portion of this exchange. He looked at his brother, the way you look at something you have been dreading and are finally, irreversibly facing with a steadiness that had clearly cost him something to build and was going to cost more to maintain. Elias, he said. Silas Elias turned toward him fully, and in that turn, Clara saw the first genuinely human thing she had witnessed in him, the smallest, fastest adjustment of his expression. Something that had lived underneath the practiced exterior. She thought it might be grief. She thought it was probably also fear, though he would never have named it that. You've got something of mine, Elias said. His voice was easy. He kept it easy with visible effort. Evidence of a federal crime, Silas said. Yes, ledgers. Maps. Elias moved to the small sitting room chairs and settled into one, crossing his legs, entirely comfortable in someone else's rented space. Numbers on paper. You know how numbers on paper work. Silas. They say what you need them to say. A good lawyer, 37 people, Silas said. Alive, with names. That's not numbers on paper. Elias's jaw tightened, very slightly, but Clara saw it. I kept you alive, Elias said, more than once. You remember that. When you were 17 and Pa had his hands around your throat, who stopped him? When you were 22 and took a bullet that should have finished you, who dragged you out? He paused. There's a debt there. Silas, a real one. Blood debt. You want to pretend that doesn't exist because it's inconvenient it exists. Silas said. Elias stopped. I know it exists. I have never forgotten it. Silas stood still in the doorway, with his hands at his sides. He looked tired. He looked profoundly sad. But his voice was steady, and he kept it that way. You were the person who kept me alive when I was a kid. That's true. You took a bullet for me. That's true. I owe you more than I could ever pay back in full. That's also true. He paused. And it doesn't change what's in those ledgers. It doesn't change the names of the people in that mine. You saved my life, and I loved you for it. Elias. But that love doesn't buy you the right to disappear 40 people into a hole in the ground. Elias was quiet. His face was working through something. Walk away, Elias said. His voice had dropped. Something underneath the smooth exterior was coming closer to the surface. Take the girl. Take Ruby's whole collection of lost causes. I'll shut the mine. I'll move on. I've got capital spread across 4 territories. This is one operation, one line on a ledger. You walk, I walk. Nobody wins everything, but nobody loses everything either. The people in that mine already lost everything, Clara said. Elias looked at her. His expression shifted into something that was close to genuine, a flash of it, quickly controlled. Miss Hayes, I'm talking to my brother. You're offering him a moral transaction that requires him to put his personal loyalty above the safety of dozens of people he's never met. She kept her voice clear and direct, not aggressive, just precise. That's not a deal between brothers. That's a test of whether he values his own comfort over other people's lives. And I've been traveling with your brother for 2 weeks, so I can tell you how that test is going to go. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Silas. You brought someone like her into this, he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost admiring and mostly resigned. I'm starting to think you didn't come here to negotiate at all. I came to stop you, Silas said. I came to do it right. Evidence, marshal, trial, whatever you think of me. I owe the people you heard a proper accounting. He looked at his brother the full, direct, heartbroken look of a man who has accepted a loss. I'm not your enemy, but I'm not going to pretend you haven't done what you've done. That's where we are. Elias sat for a long moment. He looked around the room at the documents on the table, at Clara, at Silas in the doorway. He was calculating, she could see it, running numbers, assessing angles. looking for a variable he could work with. He didn't find one. She watched him not find it. He stood, straightened his coat. For a moment, he was simply a man in a room, and the practiced authority had gone out of him. And what was left was older and more complicated, and considerably more tired. He said to Silas, "I did love you. You should know that." Silas held his gaze. "I know," Elias nodded once. He looked at Clara. "He's a better man than I made it easy for him to be," he said. "I'll give him that." Then he walked to the door and straight into the two federal marshals who had been waiting on the boarding house porch since Clara had sent word to them 20 minutes before coming downstairs. The arrest was quiet. Elias didn't fight it. She had expected him to. And then she had looked at his face again and understood he was many things, most of them destructive. But he was not stupid. He knew what was in those ledgers as well as she did. He was going to put his faith in lawyers and procedure, and the possibility that some of this could be managed on the back end. Maybe it could. That was for courts to decide. Her job was the evidence. She watched from the boarding house porch as Elias Thorne was put in irons on the main street of Red Creek. Silas stood beside her. He was looking at his brother's back as the marshals walked him toward the far end of the street, and his face had the expression of a man who had put down something enormously heavy after carrying it a very long time, not relieved, not happy, just done. The carrying was done. Clara reached over and found his hand. He held on. Mayor Galt was arrested the same afternoon. He did not accept it with anything approaching dignity. He protested loudly from his office, then from his front porch, then from the main street, where the federal marshal's additional riders had arrived, and the weight of official jurisdiction had become undeniable even to a man of Galt's particular talent for self-delusion. By the time the irons were on, he had tried 4 separate variations of "Do You Know Who I Am?" and had received 4 patient reminders that federal jurisdiction did not actually require him to be nobody. Clara watched from across the street. She had the organized evidence bundle under one arm and her father's compass in her pocket, and she watched Galt walk past in irons with the expression of a woman who has been filing something away for a long time and has just found the correct drawer for it. A small crowd had gathered, the same kind of crowd that had stood in the square 6 weeks ago and watched her on the auction block, the ranchers, the shopkeepers, the preacher in the black coat. They watched the arrest in the same silence they'd watched the auction, but the quality of the silence was different. It was the silence of people working through a revision of what they had believed was immovable. That was something. It was a start, at least. She knew better than to expect transformation in a single afternoon. People who had spent years learning that silence was survival did not unlearn it on a Wednesday. But they were watching. They were seeing that things could change, that the structure they had accepted as permanent was, in fact, a structure built by specific people, making specific choices, and that those choices could be answered for. That information would work on them, slowly. That was how change moved in places like Red Creek, not as a wave, but as a tide. Slow, steady, eventually irresistible. Silas came up beside her. He had been with the marshals for the last hour, going through procedural details, ensuring the testimony chain from Ruby's was properly documented, and that every person in that valley who needed legal recognition got its names on record, existence acknowledged, rights established in writing. "Deacon's already heading back to Ruby's with the marshal's rider," he said. "They'll have the deposition started by the weekend, and the mine. Federal property until the court process is completed. The circuit judge will appoint an overseer." He looked at her sideways. "I told them. There was a cartographer who'd already mapped the site if they needed documentation. You volunteered me for government work. I volunteered your existing work. It already exists. That's a technical distinction. You're a technical person. I thought you'd appreciate it." She looked at him. He had the look he sometimes got that careful, almost reluctant, almost smile, the one that lived right at the edge of his natural reserve. 6 weeks ago, she had not known this man. 6 weeks ago, she had been standing on a wooden platform in the dust with her wrists tied. trying to find something human in a crowd of averted eyes. The world moved fast sometimes. The afternoon was going gold at its edges by the time the official business wound down. The marshals were settled at the sheriff's office. Galt's deputy, a young man named Arroyo, who had, it turned out, been deeply unhappy with his employment situation. For approximately 2 years, had been quietly cooperative with federal inquiries, and was going to emerge from this in considerably better condition than his boss. Red Creek was already a slightly different town than it had been that morning. Clara walked to the town square. It was quiet there now. The market day crowd had dispersed, and the late afternoon light lay long and amber across the dust. The auction block stood where it had stood for years, a raised wooden platform with a low railing. Built solid, built to last. The kind of structure that existed because someone had decided it was a permanent feature of the landscape. She stood in front of it and looked at it for a long time. She thought about the day she had stood on it, the rope on her wrists, the heat, the crowd's silence, Mayor Galt's wet laugh. She thought about how it had felt to be treated as an object, to have her humanity declared irrelevant by a process as formal and bureaucratic as a land auction, as if the paperwork itself made it acceptable. It wasn't the physical experience, terrible as it had been. It was the message underneath it. The message that said, you don't own yourself. You can be priced. You can be transferred. Your life belongs to whoever can afford to bid on it. That message was in every link of the chain in the mine. It was in the payment records in Galt's ledgers. It was in the missing persons reports that no sheriff had answered. It was old, and it was practiced, and had been built into the architecture of this territory with the same care someone had used to build this platform. She pulled a match from her coat pocket. She had carried it specifically for this. She had known, without fully deciding it, since the night in the cave when she and Silas had talked about what came after. She struck it on the railing post. The wood was dry. It caught fast. She stepped back and watched the flame take the bottom rail, then the platform boards, then move upward with the unhurried certainty of fire, doing what fire does. The smoke was dark against the blood-orange sky. The light it threw was warm and alive, and it lit the faces of the few people who had stopped at the edge of the square to watch. She stood with her arms at her sides, and she watched it burn. No speech, no declaration. The fire was the statement. Everyone in that square understood it, and understanding it required no translation. It was as direct and as clear as anything that had ever been said aloud in this town. Some things are wrong. Some things need to be named as wrong, and some structures, once named, should not be allowed to keep standing. She heard the familiar step behind her, the one she'd recognized in the dark, the one she'd been tracking for 6 weeks, without fully acknowledging that she was doing it. Silas stopped a few feet back. She didn't turn around. She kept watching the fire. "You've been planning that," he said. "A little. Did you want me to try to stop you?" "Did you try to stop me?" A pause. "No." "Then you have your answer." The fire was fully committed now, the whole platform going, sending sparks up into the twilight sky in small, bright trajectories that rose and curved and went dark. Around the square, a few more people had stopped. The crowd was quiet in the same way the original crowd had been quiet, gathered, watching, aware. But the meaning of the silence was entirely different. This was not the silence of complicity. This was the silence of people watching something end. A woman near the edge of the square, Clara, couldn't see her well. In the fading light started to clap. Not loud, not performative, just one person making one sound. 2 more people joined her. Then another, a scatter of it, moving through the small crowd. Nothing like a celebration, more like recognition. Like the sound of people acknowledging that they had witnessed something real. Clara turned around. Silas was standing with his hands at his sides and his hat pushed back on his head, watching her from the shadow at the edge of the square. His face was doing the thing it did when he had decided something important and was being quiet about it. He looked at her with an expression she had learned to read over the last 6 weeks, that steady, unguarded attention that he kept aimed at the horizon until he trusted someone enough to aim it elsewhere. He tipped his hat. She turned back to the fire. She let it finish. 1 year later, the square was different. The ashes of the auction block had been cleared the morning after the fire, and in the weeks that followed, while the federal marshal's investigation worked through the courts, and the mine was formally seized, and the testimony from Ruby's Valley was entered into the record. And Elias Thorne's trial was set for the spring term. While all of that was happening, a group of people in Red Creek had gotten together and decided what to put in the empty space. The schoolhouse was Clara's idea, strictly speaking, but it had been built by 12 different people, which was the better version of how these things happened. Ruby had sent 2 of her people down to help with the construction. The freed miners had contributed a week of labor as a group, which they had offered without being asked, and which Clara had accepted because refusing would have been its own kind of condescension. Deacon had donated the lumber. Mrs. Parrish had donated the windows. It was a real building. Small, 4 walls, a proper roof, a wood stove that worked on the first attempt. A board out front that said Red Creek School. In letters Clara had carved herself with the focused, detailed attention she gave to anything she made with her hands. She taught there Monday through Friday. Children, mostly 12 of them now, with more expected in the fall term. But Friday afternoons she opened it to adults, and on those afternoons she sometimes had more students than she had on a school day. People who had never been offered the chance to read, to write, to understand a map or a ledger or a legal document. People who had been kept ignorant in the same methodical way that the mine had been kept hidden, because an informed person is harder to exploit than one who doesn't know their options. Knowledge, her father had said, was something nobody could take from you once you had it. She intended to make sure as many people as possible had it. On a Tuesday in late September, Clara came out of the schoolhouse at the end of the day and found Silas sitting on the porch. He had been the sheriff of Red Creek for 8 months. The federal marshals had recommended him, and the remaining town council, which had been reconstituted significantly after the arrests, had voted him in with the kind of unanimity that suggests a decision people had arrived at independently and were glad to make official. He wore the badge with the same absence of ceremony with which he did most things. It was a job. He did it the way he did everything, methodically, honestly, without spectacle. He had also, somewhere in the last several months, started looking less like a man waiting for something bad to happen, and more like a man who had found out that the thing he'd been dreading was survivable. He was still guarded. He was still quiet. He still spent more time watching the perimeter than was strictly necessary, but the deep exhaustion had lifted somewhat, and in its place was something that looked, from the outside, a lot like ordinary presence. He was sitting on the porch step with his hat in his hands, looking at the street, and when Clara came out, he looked up at her, the way he always looked up at her, like she was something he was quietly glad to see and was not going to make a dramatic production of. She sat down beside him. The street was doing its early evening business. People going home. A couple of horses at the rail outside the dry goods store. 2 of her Friday students, a rancher's wife, and a man who had lost 2 years of his life in the mine and was rebuilding his from the ground up, walking together down the far side of the street, talking with their heads close together over something the woman was holding. A document. It looked like a letter, maybe. Something written. Something read. Clara watched them and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing going right in a small but real way. Silas followed her gaze. He saw what she was looking at. Arroyo's wife, he said. She's been teaching Miguel to read, I know. He made it through a full paragraph yesterday, without stopping. She paused. He cried a little. We both pretended he didn't. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then Ruby's sending another group down in October. 6 people, 3 families. I know. I got the letter this morning. She looked at him. She said to tell you she's still annoyed about the timber situation. I told her I'd fix it. She says you've been saying that for 4 months. I've been busy. She has opinions about that. He made a sound that was almost exasperated and entirely fond. Clara smiled They sat for a while in the cooling evening. The light was going gold, and then deeper. The sky above Red Creek, shifting through its last colors of the day, the orange and blood red that turned to violet, that turned to the first clean dark of night. Somewhere down the street, the smell of supper was coming from 3 different houses. The lamp in the schoolhouse window, she'd left it, burning by accident, threw a small rectangle of yellow light onto the step. Her father's compass was in her pocket. It was always in her pocket. But lately she had taken to carrying it differently, not gripped, not turned over constantly, but just resting, present, done with its main work, carrying its meaning now as a thing kept rather than a thing needed. She took it out and held it flat in her palm, as she had done hundreds of times. Watched the needle settle to north, true and steady. "I've been thinking," Silas said. "About what?" He looked at his hat in his hands. He turned it once. He had a way of preparing for honesty that she recognized, not hesitation. Exactly, but a particular care. The care of someone who means what they say and wants to say it right. "About the fact that I've been living in the room above the sheriff's office for 8 months, he said, "when there is a perfectly good house at the end of this street that has been standing empty for 4 months because a woman I know bought it in June and has been fixing it up and hasn't moved into it yet." Because he paused. "I don't actually know why." Clara looked at the compass. "Because I was waiting," she said, I think, to see if she stopped. Started again, after everything that moved so fast. "I wanted to be sure that the still version was real, that it wasn't just the relief of surviving that looked like something else." He nodded slowly, and she looked at him. The street behind him, the lamplight from the school window, the sky going darker by the minute, his face which she had memorized without intending to every tired line of it, every guarded, careful, honest thing it expressed. "It's real," she said. He held her gaze. "Then I'd like to stop living above the sheriff's office." "That seems reasonable," she said. He reached over and closed his hand over hers, over the compass in her palm, the needle pointing north, the whole small weight of it. He held it gently. She turned her hand over and held his back. Down the street, the lamp in the schoolhouse window kept burning. The first stars were out over Red Creek. And for 2 people who had been running toward something, or away from something, or through something, for longer than they could clearly remember, the evening was quiet and steady and entirely, simply theirs. When the wind finally quieted over the Creston Range, it did not feel like victory at first. It felt like exhaustion. The kind that settles into the bones of men and women who have walked too far into darkness, carried too much truth, and refused, no matter how easy it would have been to turn back. 37 lives came out of that canyon. 37 names that the world had nearly erased. And if you stood there long enough, in the dust and fading smoke of that collapsed mine, you would understand something important about the West, something no map ever fully captures. Freedom is not a place you arrive at. It is something you drag others toward, even when your own strength is gone. Clara Hayes did not start this journey as a fighter. She started as a daughter, holding on to a compass and a memory, trying to understand why her father's truth had cost him everything. But somewhere between Red Creek's auction block and the depths of that mountain mine, she became something else entirely. Not because she wanted power, but because she refused to accept silence as law. There is a kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not ride in with guns blazing or speeches ringing through the air. It begins quietly, like a woman refusing to look down while standing on a block where the world tries to assign her a price. And once that kind of courage is awakened, it does not stay small. Silas Thorne understood that better than most. He was a man built by war, scarred by loss, and hardened by years of doing things that could never be fully forgiven. A man who believed survival meant staying detached, staying efficient, staying ahead of the next betrayal. But the West has a way of breaking even the most disciplined men. Not with bullets, but with people, with responsibility. with the unbearable realization that walking away is sometimes just another form of surrender. And then there was Elias Thorne, a brother not just of blood, but of contradiction. One man choosing to bury corruption, the other choosing to build an empire from it. That is the oldest story in the frontier. Two paths carved from the same origin, splitting not because of fate, but because of choice. And in the middle of it all, there were the people no one was supposed to see. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does not intend to reflect or comment on any real individual or event. Readers should approach the story as a work of fiction, not as a factual account.